processes, creating speciality knowledge about managing all of these apps and servers. That's what this cloud thing is beginning to free us up. Once we simplify the management of applications that don't differentiate, push them away if possible, simplify the data center by going to this software-defined data center, then we can start thinking about, so how do we support differentiation of the business? How do we invest in IT to allow us to do something better or to do something different? And the places where I think we expect people to invest are much more around platform as a service and things like that, where you want to build on your existing intellectual property that you've created that differentiates you and allow you to iterate faster and deliver new value to market as quickly as possible. It's all about minimum time to profit and revenue in this world. So the world I used to work in e-commerce, for example, the value of platform is that many e-commerce companies, maybe some very large percentage of their revenue doesn't actually go through the website. It goes through their APIs. And so it's a platform for other people to innovate on top of because they're able to address markets that the original company wasn't able to. And they have new ideas. In fact, by opening up APIs and having other people develop on your platform, you unleash innovation by actually allowing more people to have ideas and extend the value of your platform or your application or your services or whatever it is. I think it was Bill Joy when I was at Sun who said, innovation happens, it just tends to happen somewhere else. It's a kind of law of numbers thing, right? I think Google's policy here is we'll just hire as many smart people as possible to maximize the probability that we'll get innovation. But the net effect is it tends to happen somewhere else. So the question is, how do you maximize your ability to attract talent and innovation? And it's about creating ecosystems of value. And so getting other people to build these new things on top of your platform and monetizing it. So in the case of e-commerce sites like eBay and Amazon, they monetize every transaction because no one who builds those apps over the top is differentiated by building a platform that can support 280 million users and 250 million items. That stuff's really, really hard. But they can be differentiated by attacking a niche market they have better intimacy with or being in a specific region of the world. So that's the opportunity here. So there's a simplification thing that's going on too. The other opportunity here is around flexibility. So if we say that there's a set of technologies that get us over this problem of complexity, once we've simplified things, we can be much more agile and flexible in a way that we never could in the past. So one of the trends that we're seeing going on there right now, and again, I think Crawford alluded to it, and there was this kind of, in a big sense, is that really we're seeing hybridization of cloud to some greater or lesser degree. The difficulty for most customers is that when they look at public cloud, or most people when they look at public cloud, it doesn't look anything like your own internal data center. If you look at Amazon or Google or whatever, and you kind of do a sniff test of the thing, it probably requires, the applications behave differently to the ones I typically run inside the data center. They're written differently. They have a different set of assumptions. The tools I use to manage it are fundamentally different to the ones I use in my data center. The people who have the skills to manage it have different skills. And the processes for managing the lifecycle in these public clouds is different. So what we're beginning to see now is an opportunity for creating hybrid cloud infrastructure where the clouds inside your data center and the clouds outside are beginning to look very much the same. So there is this battle going on from people coming from the outside into your data center, and there's the battle from inside your data center going out to the cloud to create infrastructure that is essentially the same inside as out. What that really means is there ceases to be a technology reason to prevent you from moving your applications in and out. Remember we talked about the software-defined data center where we've decoupled your application from the infrastructure. Once you've done that and you have this homogeneous infrastructure inside and out, the only reasons to prevent you moving your apps backwards and forwards when you want to become business choices around data sovereignty, regulatory compliance, and trust. They're not technology reasons. The technology friction disappears and you end up with an interesting set of choices as to where you put your apps. And so we're seeing an extension of the data center out into the public cloud and infrastructure that's beginning to look the same on both sides. And that's happening in two directions, from the inside out, but also from the outside in. The opportunity there is that you end up having choices as to where you run your applications. But some of the big things, it's the same people and processes and tools that you're used to. So it's actually about minimizing risk. Again, a big opportunity here. It's pretty fundamental. When you think about bursting, by the way, in my experience, if you're going to genuinely burst, you need applications that are designed to do it, typically with caching in between the tiers and things like that. Otherwise, what we see is people moving entire application sets backwards and forwards. And it requires a little bit of planning, but you can take advantage of this stuff relatively easily, right? There's an enormous opportunity out there. So one of the benefits here, if we start looking at cloud economics, if you will, and I would say the economics of cloud are pretty profoundly different. From the place I came, if I look at the traditional kind of breakdown here, I think historically 85% of the cost of service delivery has always been people and software, to some measure, right? Some of that is hidden in lines of business sometimes when they own applications and so forth. In the cloud provider space, like a Google and eBay and Amazon, they actually flip the cost model. So in the traditional world, the reason that split is that way, I would strongly argue, is based on the number of applications you own. Every application has all of that process and people skills wrapped around it, which makes scaling really hard. I would argue we've never got economies of scale out of IT. We can get efficiencies of purchasing, but we don't get economies of scale. Now, if you look at the cloud providers, they do get economies of scale. They get it through extreme simplification. Remember, we talked about simplification. So a cloud provider like a Google, an Amazon, or an eBay will have a handful of patterns. With a handful of patterns, you can automate like crazy. And then you can flip your cost model, and their cost model is 80% physical infrastructure. And when it's 80% physical infrastructure to deliver their service, their biggest cost turns out to be energy. Which is why when you see these huge data centers, they're all about maximizing the efficiency of the power supply of every server they have. They're around minimizing the number of unnecessary chips on a motherboard. You know, how many USB ports do you actually need on a server? They run their data centers 10 degrees hotter than the manufacturers recommend because the energy to power and cool the servers is much more expensive than the cost of replacing broken servers. And they put their data centers in interesting locations with cheap energy. And I say cheap. Green and renewable is all good, but it's ultimately about cheap. Because the interesting metric in this world turns into not price performance, but throughput per kilowatt. But this, if we look at what's happening in a custom space when people can take advantage of these cloud providers and do public and private cloud infrastructure, ultimately we see things moving into a kind of portfolio play, and that money can be saved both on pure private use of public cloud, although the cost split shifts significantly. You end up with a big rental cost and network infrastructure for pure public cloud if you're going to go that way. But we see that this hybrid model where people are picking and choosing the apps and services and where to run them on an individual basis and figuring out the best balance for them allows for a lot of opportunity around cost savings. So let's go back to, let me whiz through very quickly. I think we've talked about applications and how they're shifting. For me, the way I see it is what we're doing is refactoring the traditional stack. So probably all of you, when you thought of applications when you were young and they were teaching you, everything was three-tier, right? There's kind of persistence, there's business logic, and there's presentation, right? The back end that is persistence used to be an OLTP database because that's the thing we used to know how to manage, how to scale, how to do interesting things with. So we put everything in an OLTP database because it seemed like an easy thing to do. Today, that tier is being refactored. So when we talk about big data, what we're really meaning here is that we're shifting from tradition. You know, we used to think of the world as batch and OLTP, right? Now the workloads are hybrid. So for example, when someone goes to an e-commerce site to look for something, the first thing you want to do is if you don't have the thing they're looking for, you want to find something that they might like. So you figure out what they bought in the past and what other people who bought what they bought in the past went on to buy. You find out what their friends are buying. You find out what accessories are popular for the things they bought in the past. And then you end up with this kind of Amazon model with millions of recommendations, and you maximize your monetization of every single interaction with your marketplace. If you think about swiping a credit card, that's all big data too. You have 30 microseconds, 30 milliseconds? I can never remember the number. There's a 30 in it anyway. You swipe a card, and you want to run as many algorithms as possible in that time frame to minimize the risk of fraud. The more algorithms you can run, the lower the risk of fraud, the greater the profitability of every transaction that you undertake. So these are what we would consider high-performance computing, grid, big data, happening in line with transactions. There's no longer this split. If you look at Facebook, every page for their 1 billion users is customized and rendered in real time. So the application stack is fundamentally shifting. That bottom layer is shifting. If we think of big data come high-performance computing, think of cars and automobiles. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was a case of, can we write a simulation algorithm so that we can predict how a car will crash, and it's accurate simulation, right? 5 years ago, it's, oh, we can stop crashing cars now. Now it's how many simulations can I run to optimize the car for safety so that I can differentiate my business by having the safest car. It's all about data. It's all about insight. It's all about doing it and collecting it in real time. If I look at some of the projects that we've undertaken for customers, you look at things like the US government, they're aggregating all of their military assets in real time so that Obama can look at every single tank and plane and submarine and soldier anywhere in the world and pulling all of that stuff together so they can make decisions in real time. If you look at the stock market and the mini crash that we had last year, right? I'm sure you're aware of it. There was, I think the market lost, what was it, 20%? Maybe 25% of its value, I don't know, a few $1 trillion, nothing much. And it tanked in less than a second. And then it came back in a few seconds more, and it kind of steadied itself. And they still don't know what's going on, because the algorithms were sitting there competing with each other. There was a war of algorithms. And the machines have kind of run away with this stuff. But this big data thing is happening. Is anyone out there a fan of science fiction? Does anyone sort of Asimov and the Foundation trilogy, right? Come on, there must be some nerds and geeks in the room here. Yep, own up, fess, it's okay. So when I was a kid, I read the Foundation trilogy, which I found fascinating, and there was this notion of a science called psychohistory, where by studying the behavior of masses of human beings in the past, you could predict the future. That's what we're doing today. That's big data. We understand mass behavior by capturing vast amounts of data, and then we personalize every single interaction in real time to maximize the value. That value could be making money and selling. It could be the government maximizing its connectedness with its citizens. It could be any number of things. But we're seeing these systems, and these data points are coming in not just through web browsers, they're coming through the Internet of Things, they're coming from everywhere. If I'm a railroad company, I've got sensors all over my tracks and my locomotives. If I'm GE, I've got sensors on my jet engines. Just to give you a sense of where GE is going, we spun off a part of VMware about 2 months ago, called Pivotal, which has some of our assets around big data. And GE became a co-investor with us in that. So they have become part of a technology provider company, not just a consumer of technology. They recognize how critical it is to start using these technologies. They're fundamental to shaping the world that we're moving towards. So the app stack is changing. The middle tier is shifting, is becoming really about business transformation. And the presentation tier we talked about with mobile and all the contextual stuff. That is all shifting. So bringing it all together, really, let's see what cloud is kind of doing if we've got this simplification happening on the underlying infrastructure so we can start thinking about how we invest. We've got flexibility that's given to us by the notion of cloud and software-defined data centers too. Let's go back and say, so what are the impacts on business and what is really happening out there and how does it impact you as the CIO? What is really happening? So for me, cloud, I showed this slide last year, is very profound. My initial mistake when I saw the cloud world, and I've been talking about it, I guess, for the best part of 6 years, is that I viewed it through the lens of a technologist, and I said, this looks, smells, and feels like everything I've seen before. It's just an extension. Didn't we have, utility computing, agile enterprise, adaptive, whatever? There's this long list of things, right? All using similar technologies. And I thought, haven't we been here before? I made a fundamental mistake, because the point is it's actually a business model shift. A notion of self-service, instantly provisioned, pay for what you use, cost-efficient and elastic IT is something we've never, ever had before. If you wanted to make your apps run, remember those thousands of apps, you bought software, you bought hardware, you installed one on the other, or you paid someone else to do it for you, usually with some long upfront contract to do it. So you had no way of differentiating between the IT services that genuinely differentiate you as a business and the ones that you want to treat as a commodity. You know, email, healthcare, payroll, all of that stuff, right, that you just want to get rid of. There was no way of really getting rid of it in the past, but now we can because we have this cloud thing, and we can go away and rent it. We not only rent it at VMware, we've actually changed some of the suppliers there, and we were able to sit there, treat it as a commodity, get rid of one supplier, and bring another supplier in. It's not entirely trivial, but you can do it. And so this is really changing a bunch of things, because it's allowing businesses to transform themselves by de-investing in the IT that doesn't differentiate and shifting it to the IT that does and trying to innovate and to do new things. It's leveling the playing field. So when I look at New Zealand and I think what cloud is doing, if you think that the internet provided organizations with global access to markets to sell their goods and services, the cloud is providing organizations with global access to IT resources from which they can build businesses. The barriers to entry to marketplaces, the barrier to entries to innovation are no longer technological barriers. Your ability to succeed is driven by your intimacy with the marketplace and regulatory compliance and your ideas. It's not about technology. You can buy the technology with a credit card. Heck, I remember hanging out with startups in the Bay Area, which is one of the great joys, right? And I remember, hearing the story about how Pierre founded eBay. And one Labor Day weekend, which is a bank holiday in the United States, he went to Fry's or some equivalent electronics store, he bought 3 servers and he put them in his bedroom cupboard or something. $20 billion later, he lives in Hawaii or whatever the heck it is. But this is what startups used to do. They would go and buy a whole bunch of machines, put them in their cupboard, set them all up. They'd all overheat. They'd then have to find some colo space, and they'd have to have money for all of this stuff. Now they just have a credit card, and they're done. This is really profound and transformative, right? Innovation, and the pace of innovation is changing. So, if you look here, you'll see this is the length of time it's taken certain technologies to get into 10 million households. I have no idea whether this is in the United States or globally, but it doesn't really matter. The telephone took 38 years, Facebook 2 or thereabouts, and there's clearly a compounding effect on many of these things. So we see this rate of change increasing and increasing. And then we start looking at, what does this mean for businesses? What happens to businesses here in this space? So I joke in the United States, I come from so far back east, there happens to be an ocean in the way. And the Encyclopedia Britannica is something dear to my heart. People would come along and they would sell them, and people would buy this beautiful array of encyclopediae or whatever with, all that leather, and you'd look on the bookshelf and you get annual updates, and you'd look smart and all of the good stuff that goes with it. $600 million a year business in 1990. By the mid-90s, Encarta had destroyed their business model. The revenues were halved. Has anyone seen an Encarta CD recently? Right? The answer is no. So Wikipedia came along and destroyed their business model completely and utterly. Not only do you have 600 million readers, you have 600 million potential contributors. This is fundamentally different, right? Those contributors can go out with their cameras and mobile devices, take photos with geospatial information and time information and everything else, and load up stuff. They can be reporters. It's amazing. I would recommend, if you want a really interesting experience, watch a Wikipedia article grow in real time. So I watched the article about the current Pope when he was being elected. So I saw that this candidate seemed to be the guy. They were just announcing that he was being elected. So I went to the Wikipedia page for Cardinal whatever from Argentina. And it was chaos, right? There were all these paragraphs being added, and there were things about child molestation and collaboration with dictatorships and all of that good stuff. But after about 18 hours, you ended up with an article that was actually relatively accurate. It was good enough. I mean, it was funny. It has that property of distributed systems, which is it was eventually consistent or correct, whichever way you want to look at it. And I didn't have to wait a year for my update to the Encyclopedia Britannica. And in fact, 2012, since I last spoke to you, 2012 was the last year you could buy a brand new Encyclopedia Britannica. They're done. They're finished. They're gone. So that's 3 business models in 20 years. Fundamentally different. Now we look at something like movie rental. If you want to be scared, this is 3 business models in 10 years. So Blockbuster, I don't know whether they still exist in New Zealand. They don't exist in the United States anymore. The only reason I would go there was to buy a cheap second-hand Blu-ray because they were going out of business. I like to digitize my Blu-rays because owning the physical goods gives me legal rights that I don't believe having the download does. I'm kind of old school in a sad kind of way, and not representative of my children or anyone else who's younger. But Blockbuster, healthy business less than 10 years ago. Netflix ate their lunch by basically sitting there saying, no late fees, you send us a list of the movies you want. When you return one DVD, we send you the next. They figured out that being in the physical logistics business was not the right place to be, and saw the writing on the wall with iTunes and said, you know, they bifurcated their own business. They chose to eat their own lunch before Amazon and iTunes did it for them. They communicated it relatively poorly and suffered in the short term, but in the long term, they created a new sustainable way of doing things. And the amazing thing about Netflix is they're no longer just a channel for sending the media, they're a production house. They did a series that was based on the UK series House of Cards, which you may be familiar with here. They did an American version of it. And through customer intimacy and use of big data, they really understand how Americans like to watch serials, especially short-run serials, which is a very large number of people like to watch them as a marathon. So instead of actually releasing an episode a week, they released the entire series in one go so that people could spend their weekends watching them as a marathon. These people are using IT as a weapon to change business models and to do things differently. This is not about the old IT where you sit there and say, this is the way I've always done it, let's optimize by automation. The times for that have gone in the past. You know, there's an enormous set of drivers for business model transformation today. Many old established businesses are no longer making money that they should do. They're not using the technology correctly. The people who do use the new technologies and are refactoring themselves are growing faster and moving away from their competitors so quickly. The interesting thing is it doesn't take long for a new competitor to appear, it just takes a very long time for an old competitor to die. What happens is you don't grow. And you can sustain yourself for a very long period of time, but certainly in the United States, the market kills you if you don't have growth. So you have to have growth. It's become incredibly competitive. So to give you a sense of this churn and evolution of businesses, on the S&P in 1970, if you looked over a 5-year period, 90% of the companies would be there at the end of 5 years. In the 2010s, only 65% of the companies are there at the end of 5 years. We're seeing companies churn and come and go quicker and quicker. And we're seeing the need to address emerging markets. These are really driving organizations to transform their business models in very, very fundamental ways. What we see happening is a shift in the use cases that IT is being used for. So the old one was labor automation, right? You sit there and you've got a repetitive task. Think all those things I talked about data center activities before, all these repetitive tasks. You want to automate the repetitive task because it makes it more reliable. Remove human variability, okay? Unfortunately, we've reached the point of diminishing returns in terms of automating human labor. Then you improve productivity, because once you've automated it, you can increase the rate of iteration, okay? But again, we're entering this world where we see diminishing returns on investment. The second one is non-human scale computing. This always confused the hell out of me. I always thought, what the heck is human scale computing? Yeah? Then I discovered that my wife's aunt had the job title of computer. She actually worked at GCHQ, which is the British code cracking establishment, and she was a mathematician. So her job description was computer. But I don't think you see anyone with the job title of computer anymore. But now you see, what we saw was really starting to use the algorithms we were familiar with to do things subtly differently. Now what we're seeing is a fundamental shift in these use cases. Very specifically, we've gone from labor automation to business model transformation. And I'll give you a scary example in a minute, right? So in the same way that we think of in the internet age today of mashing up music and audio, video, and everything else, we have an opportunity here to mash up business processes, change the way we're doing things. We're seeing individual worker productivity shift to the team. How do I get 1 + 1 = 3? I had the pleasure of doing some work with the National Science Foundation in the United States on virtual organizations and innovation at distance. And there is an enormous amount to show that innovation tends to happen when you don't have monocultures, when you have lots of people with different skill sets interacting on a regular basis. And the vast majority of new ideas and big breakthroughs in science have been interdisciplinary, where you get a physicist working with a sociologist who does a whole bunch of stuff around virtual organizations and working and things like that. You actually want these interesting activities. And the way people interact is fundamentally different. Now, if I look at my 21-year-old daughter, she's typical of the new workforce, right? So let me see, what does she do? She never ever reads email. She never ever writes email. She does everything via messaging, and she does it all on a social networking site. Until last year, she didn't even have a laptop. She did everything on a mobile device. She only had a laptop because she's at university, and because she has dyslexia, the British government bought her one. That is the workforce of the future. They interact in fundamentally different ways. When we were talking about the social side of things, there is no underestimating the transformation this will wreak upon us. So in this NSF meeting that I was at, I think one of the things I found most enlightening is we had 40 people around the table. The smartest sociologists and organizational psychologists in the United States of America, plus 20 high-energy physicists and computer scientists, because they do a lot of collaboration at distance. And then there was little old me who worked for a commercial organization. And we were discussing collaboration, and they were kind of sitting there saying, well, we could have these big three-dimensional caves with surround sound, and we could do all of this really cool interactive stuff and immersive stuff. And I was sitting there reminding myself, and I was thinking, we had this conversation at dinner last night, this is our generation's problem, right? We go out and we buy Star Wars every time it's reissued with better sounds and in higher definition, right? Our children don't care. They just want convenience, anytime, any place on the device of their choice. It's that simple. And their interaction model is fundamentally different. They infer a lot more from a really cursory text message than we ever would. So for us to assume they're going to work the same way we do is broken. And I bet you don't work the same way that your CIO worked when you started your career. So we shouldn't make the assumptions that all of these people who come in with consumer expectation to the enterprise are suddenly going to become driven by enterprise expectation. And then on the data side, it's getting scary. It really is. It's algorithmic warfare. These stuff, they're self-learning, they tune themselves, they change the business model in real time. And they're doing it on a time scale that the human brain cannot comprehend. I think it's in the tenths of a second that it takes a human brain to figure out that two things are different by looking at them. These algorithms run in a nanosecond space. There's no way you can actually figure out, slow them down. You're talking lots of zeros, right? It's pretty insane. So the impact of this new IT, just to kind of give you a sense of what's going on here, we'll use that famous bookstore that's somewhat north of us. It's unfair to really call them that. They've actually changed the game in so many ways. Firstly, they changed the way of doing things. Logistics. Has anyone seen how Amazon do logistics? It's the one place they never used to let you into, was their warehouse, right? They don't use robots. They randomly distribute goods around their warehouse the same way that you randomly distribute data in a database and across disks to stop hotspotting. Totally unintuitive, very, very successful. They were on the thinnest of margins, their business, right? They eliminate value chain intermediaries. So no one prints books anymore. They're all printed on demand or electronically shipped. So you can get all your old ones and they'll just print them on demand. They actually do publishing on demand too. You don't have to be signed to Random House to publish a book. This might mean a very large number of pretty crap books out there if we're not careful. But the point is, it's democratized publishing. You're starting to get a sense here of the ripples that Bezos' empire is actually creating out there. It's pretty amazing. They introduced a new monetization model. They use the services they built to support their business and resell them and make money from it. It's genius, right? Absolute genius. Then they go away and they use big data to be able to support Prime. So they can do fixed price shipping because they know exactly how many people ship what goods to where. My wife hates their big data algorithms. I've been a loyal Amazon customer since 1999. They know me better than I know myself. They make recommendations to me for music that I would never get from any number of friends or social networks, and they're invariably correct. I buy CDs or stream music from them unheard. I don't even bother trying it out. I know I'm going to like it. So I spend 3 times as much as my wife would like me to spend on Amazon. This is all about taking big data and turning it into a weapon. And then, because they cornered the market in books, people go there to buy their second-hand books too. And if you want to look at the impact, as Crawford said before, when we were answering questions, they've changed the high street forever. There's nowhere I can go to find CDs, Blu-rays, DVDs, books. They're almost all gone. In the United Kingdom, you can order your goods in the morning and they'll be on your doorstep when you get home from work the same day. Next year, they're going to be shipping groceries, including beer. And so when we have telemetry in the fridge, remember the stock control system in your fridge that works out that there's an All Blacks game tonight, I'd better get some beer in. It's not that far from reality. It really isn't. Yeah? This stuff is really fundamentally changing things. This is using IT as a weapon. So what we see here is a redefinition of the role of IT. This is fundamental for you guys. Truly fundamental, right? The purpose of the organization is shifting from being the sole provider of technology to the business to really managing a portfolio of internal and external assets, applications, infrastructure, data sets, and data streams. Purchasing. People are going to make choices about their balance of OpEx and CapEx. You're going to have a set of ways of doing things that are different. You're going to have choices and flexibility. Security. This is actually pretty scary, right? When you're running on a cloud, you don't know what's underneath you, and when you're consuming on an iPhone, someone else owns it. So how do you create a secure application, secure client, and a secure interaction over an infrastructure that's inherently insecure? Well, solving that problem is a big deal, but actually will get us away from so many of the things they're actually worried about. The point is you have to change the assumptions that you make. It's like the cloud applications assume every server breaks. They don't assume that you're going to have failover. They say if everything breaks eventually, let's just accept it, make it a loss of capacity and not a loss of data and throughput or anything else. The applications, instead of owning all the apps, you're going to integrate stuff that runs on-premise, as SaaS. Say we have 70 of these things. Policies, you're going to move away from how do we create a run book and make people stick to it, to actually, it's actually about governance processes. How do I have the right policies for governance of my IT, of my applications, of my services, of how I pull all my stuff together? Data, it's about being able to see everything and to be able to ask any question of all of that data. Data is the source of differentiation. It provides you intimacy with your marketplace, your environment, your customers, everything. It's the stuff that it is the raw material. If you think about Australia having this enormous mining opportunity with natural resources, these data sets are their own opportunity. There's going to be this Wild West scenario with people going out there trying to mine all the data sets and ask interesting questions. And it's about enabling the lines of business to start driving choice. In many cases, they already do to some degree. They may choose an application and tell you what to do, but this is about a different kind of partnership and getting lines of business to recognize that IT can be providing them with more flexibility and choice. So let me finish off. When I think of strategy, this is actually driving VMware strategy, but we see that VMware strategy is driven essentially by mapping to what our customers and where you guys are going. In terms of, it's all about applications at the end of the day. How do we enable, IT is about delivering the right applications at the right quality of service at the right price, flexibly, safely, securely compliant. How do we as an industry enable you to do that simply and not get bogged down in all that complexity of all those activities, the people, the processes, the installing, monitoring, managing, archiving, all of that stuff. How do we get rid of all of that complexity? How do we give people choices as to where they run their applications, on or off-prem, based on your needs. It becomes a business choice, a regulatory compliance choice, not a technology issue. An end user about enabling people to get at the apps and services they want anytime, any place, the device of their choice.